Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Community Archives lecture. So we'll be talking about community archives and activism. So here are our weekly topics and course objectives for the week. What is archival activism? What is the link between archival activism and community archives? And how are activist archives examples of liberatory memory work? And we'll actually be looking at all of our course objectives for this week. Okay, so to look at what is archival activism, in many ways, archival activism is both a response to challenges and also a challenge themselves. So activist archives challenge the concept of archival neutrality, the idea that archives shouldn't take sides in history. As we all know, that concept has been pretty well refuted, but the idea of archives sort of directly contributing to activists or engaging in activism themselves is maybe a little bit of a step further than acknowledging that archives do have a role in shaping history and shaping identity and things of that nature. So this is maybe a greater challenge to the concept of archival neutrality than the one that we've talked about in this course, and that you may have seen in other archives related courses as well. So as C4 describes, archival activism seeks to guide the active role of an archivist towards support of human and political rights. So this idea of taking what archives do and orienting them in a way that supports human and political rights. Archival activism can also challenge conceptions of the archive itself, which the Selly article touches on. So challenging how archives operate, challenging a lot of the more traditional notions of things like access, especially, which the Selly article touches on. And we've talked about what some of those challenges look like throughout this semester. So the Carter article from week 1, which I mentioned, is really focused on the idea of archival activism, also talks about how some of the archives mentioned in that article really challenge the ideas of what archives are and how archives can operate. The Selly article also talks about activist archives challenging the power dynamics in society. And this really goes back to this idea of liberatory memory work. So liberatory memory work is fundamentally activities that are meant to redefine who has power in society, to take power away from people throughout history that have typically wielded it, so white male capitalists, and redistribute it to other people, again, in the support of human and political rights. So activist archives and archival activism is definitely a challenge to those power dynamics. And we've talked about some of the things that archival activism may directly challenge or attempt to impact. So we've talked about gentrification a few times in this course, and again, white supremacy in society and other issues that that activists tend to work against. And you can go back to this idea of archival activism in an attempt to challenge power dynamics in society and redistribute power to the reason why community archives form in the first place. So again, to recap something that we talked about in week 1, you have a community that coalesces around a shared identity and shared experiences. And then there can be this trigger where the community realizes that there's a lack of accurate representation of the community, either in archives or the media or both. There's a sense of marginalization that may extend from that lack of accurate representation, probably other things that the community is facing, such as gentrification, maybe a lack of political power, maybe a lack of financial power. And there's also a sense that the community itself is viable, that it is sort of a solidified, cohesive body. And that may lead to the creation of a community archive, which is at least an attempt by the community to represent itself and to fight back against the marginalization that the community feels it is experiencing. So anytime a community is trying to regain the power, or maybe gain the power for the first time, to represent itself instead of have itself represented by other people, that's fundamentally an attempt to gain power and an attempt to pursue some of the human rights and political goals that the C4 article mentions as being a couple of things that activist archives can work towards. So you can see the seeds of potential activism from the very reasons why community archives exist in the first place. And you can argue that to varying degrees, community archives are activist endeavors. They are fundamentally an effort by communities to gain power that has been denied them by the entrenched power structures and power dynamics in society. Now, as we'll talk about later, community archives may feel more or less of a sense of a need to really actively fight against marginalization, and that can lead them to addressing activism to varying degrees. But again, that's something that we will talk about later on in this lecture. So it's interesting to look at this community-centric framework that Jill Lind describes or offers, and see how we can relate this idea of archival activism into this framework. So how can we connect the idea of using archives to help a community represent itself, to help a community fight against marginalization within some of the things mentioned in this framework? So anytime the community's interests, needs, and well-being are central, that is going to require the community to have power. The power to say, our interests, needs, and well-being matter, and we are deserving of that respect and that appreciation for our well-being. And you can argue that a situation where a community's interests, needs, and well-being are central is one of the goals of archival activism. So one of the reasons why communities may create community archives in the first place is to create a situation where the community's interests, needs, and well-being are central. And again, ideally, that's what a community archive strives towards. It strives to create a space where the community's well-being is sort of the central focus of archival activity. So you can see how community archives can be an activist step towards this type of situation taking place. Looking at the second bullet point here, community records and materials are understood and valued in their originating context and not viewed by mainstream institutions as collectibles, salvage projects, or vehicles for diversifying existing collections. Again, this is sort of an ideal state for a community's records, to where the community is well regarded and thought of as being important, and the community's records just aren't kind of like a box for mainstream archives to check in an effort to appear to be more diverse or more politically correct. So again, this is similar to the first bullet point. This is a state of being that can not only be something that a community can strive for, but something that ideally community archives can provide. And ideally community archives can create a situation where this type of context is sort of understood and celebrated, and not just viewed as, again, kind of like a box to check, and not really a set of records that is really allowed to exist kind of on its own rules and in its own shape and form, as opposed to a shape and form imposed by mainstream archivists. Okay, and then this last one, dealing with community complexity and flux. Again, this is kind of a good end goal for what activism can achieve, to where a community is being portrayed as, you know, being complex, where a community's, you know, demographics and emotions and changes over time are illustrated and recognized and thought of as being important, and a state of affairs where those complexities and changes and emotions are really brought to bear on archival practice. And it's also interesting to think about how, when all three of these occur, or really any of these occur, it can give a community more ammunition to achieve further activist goals. So if a community's interests, needs, and well-being are central, then a community may have a stronger sense of identity and a stronger sense of belonging in society, and a stronger sense of history. And of course, that refers to the idea of representational belonging, which we'll touch on before. So not only is this type of framework a goal for activism to strive for, but it can be the fuel for perhaps greater activism in the future. So we'll look at some more characteristics of archival activism. So again, challenge archival practices that annihilate, you know, challenging archival practices that in the past have led to communities and community members being disempowered, whether it is appraisal practices that ignore community records, whether it's descriptive practices that mislabel community members or incorrectly describe the history and accomplishments of a community. whether it's preservation acts that work against communities' cultural preferences and is harmful to the community in that way. Archival activism really works against those. And again, values the community and views the community as being worthy of having that community's well-being centralized in archival practice. Motivated by political activism, as we'll talk about later on, intention is a big part of archival activism. You know, there has to be some interest in gaining power and consolidating power within the community and within the community archive. As we've talked about before, the formation of community archives is, I would argue, fundamentally an act of archival activism. As we'll touch on later, there has to be some overlap between community involvement in the collection of activist materials. And again, this idea of intentionality, this idea that we as a community intend to engage in activist efforts and attempt to gain or regain power through the actions that we take. The Flynn article describes some actions that can be a part of archival activism. So mobilizing solidarity, emphasizing identity through exploring past history, learning from past struggles the community has faced, developing educational materials, intervening in public debates, challenging discrimination, and documenting human rights abuses. And we'll look at how some of those relate to some of the concepts that we've talked about in class here in just a little bit. Okay, so again, to kind of elaborate on something I just talked about, a truly activist archive is one that involves not just the collection of activist materials, but community involvement as well. So as the Selly article discusses, if it's a situation where an archive is just snapping up activist records, but the community that those records came from isn't really involved in record-keeping decisions surrounding those records, then that's not really an activist archive. It's activating or archiving activism. And the Selly article talks about how that can actually be harmful if it results in people represented in those records being subject to legal repercussions for their activist activities. You know, that's certainly a harmful potential side effect of archiving activism. Whereas if it's a situation like the interference archive, where members of the community are making record-keeping decisions surrounding the records, and the Selly article talks pretty explicitly about the desire to, you know, not keep records of who's using these materials, protecting the identities of people represented within the materials as much as possible, and other steps meant to safeguard the well-being of the community, then that is definitely a different context than archiving activism, where the archive making record-keeping decisions about records might have no connection with the community and may actually act in ways that can harm the community, you know, whether intentionally or not. So to explore the connection between archival activism and community archives a little bit more, it is helpful to look at some of the different acts that activist archives can engage in that the Flynn article touches on, and to think of ways that community archives can be used to accomplish some of these goals. So obviously community archives can be used to mobilize solidarity. If community archives help a community strengthen its sense of identity, strengthen its sense of value, then that can lead to a community feeling more of a sense of power, more of a sense of connection, and that can lead to a community engaging in acts that are more activist, simply because they have the sense that, you know, we're not alone. We are connected to other people, and we can see that through the history of our community that the community archive provides. We see that through events that the community archive has, where community members get together and, you know, interact with each other and socialize. And that can definitely, you know, make people feel more like a part of the community, and that can lead to people feeling like their community is more powerful, you know, now that it's sort of more solidified, and you know, more like a clenched fist instead of an open hand. Community archives are definitely well equipped to help community members explore their identity through history. So, you know, using community records to, again, get this sense of history, get this sense of belonging, and exploring your community's identity through history can really help you understand and learn from past struggles that your community has experienced. And that's something that the Caswell chapter for this week talks about. And we'll touch on that more later. Community archives can be really useful for developing educational materials. So developing exhibits, developing, you know, online collections, developing pamphlets and brochures that the community can use to educate other members of the community, to educate people outside of the community, and that can maybe help the community gain advocates for its activist efforts. It can solidify the sense of belonging and history that the community itself feels, and both these things can really help the community be on a better footing to engage in activist acts. Intervention in public debates. Again, the sense of community and solidarity and cohesion that community archives can help a community develop can make a community feel more empowered to intervene in public debates, as opposed to, you know, being just kind of passively impacted by decisions made by other people in society. So again, once you see other people around you that have the same history, have maybe shared interests, have experienced some of the same things that you have as a community member, and you start to get that sense of identity and that sense of cohesion, then that can really make you more likely to want to intervene and want to flex a little bit and use your power as a community and as a community member to intervene in public debates and attempt to have more control over what goes on in the society around you. Community archives can definitely help communities document rights abuses that the community has experienced. If there are records that community members have provided, you know, whether they're personal archives or more quote unquote official or evidential archives, that's something that a community archive can definitely collect and share with other community members. And these records can also serve as proof or evidence that a community has been wronged in the past and that they deserve some kind of compensation or some form of reparations for what the community has endured. If there's no evidence that something happened, then it's going to be very difficult for a community to be able to say, hey, we deserve to be compensated for this horrible thing that our community has experienced in the past. There has to be some kind of memory framework that supports the fact that a particular event or a set of events took place, and here is the evidence that these events occurred. And especially if a community archive has a strong connection to the community that it represents, that community archive can be in a good position to collect these records and make them available for whatever activist purpose they might be best used for. Okay, and community archives can definitely be tools to help challenge discrimination and to change policies. So again, this idea that a shared sense of identity can lead to cohesion, which can lead to more of a willingness to challenge things going on in society, more of a willingness to attempt to change public policy, and community archives can definitely be powerful facilitators for that sense of identity and power taking place. And I think community archives can also serve as good resources to prove that a community has been discriminated against. So if you have records in your community archive that demonstrate ways in which certain actions have discriminated against your community, or if you can show evidence that certain policies have harmed your community, then that just gives you more ammunition for trying to change these policies and these discriminative acts in the future. So kind of related to documenting human rights abuses. And again, it's important to note that not all of these possible actions of activist archives are going to be applicable to every community. It's just going to depend on the community. There may be a community that hasn't really experienced things that sort of rise to the level of human rights abuses. There may be community archives that represent communities that haven't really been discriminated against, or don't really, have any desire to change policies in society. So how relevant community archives can be towards accomplishing some of these goals is going to depend on the community that the community archive is representing. Most of the communities that we've talked about in this class, or that you tend to think of when you think of community archives, have experienced some kind of discrimination and marginalization in the past, but especially archives that are centered around shared interests, or things that are maybe less frequently the target of marginalization. Some of these might not be as relevant for community archives of that nature. And so because of that, I like to think of activism and community archives as being a spectrum. So a spectrum of activism. And this is something that the Flynn and Sexton reading for this week talks about. Some community archives may be less politically motivated than others. So Caswell would argue that activism is sort of an essential characteristic that makes a community archive a community archive. I'm not necessarily sure that I agree, but I think that intentionally or not, a lot of almost every community archive is formed as the result of a sense of not belonging in society and a sense of a lack of representation in society. And they are fundamentally meant to kind of right that wrong. And it can be either like a capital W wrong or a lowercase w wrong. It can be like sustained abuse and discrimination that a community has endured throughout its history, or it can be just, I don't really see a lot of myself, in society and the media. I don't see a lot of information out there about um, bisexual Dungeons and Dragons players, so I'm gonna try and fix that. And so a community in a community archive that maybe hasn't experienced as much as much adversity in history may just engage in a pretty low level of what we can think of as archival activism. So maybe they're just interested in exploring their identity through history, maybe developing some educational materials to get more information out there about the community, but they aren't as inclined to tackle some of the things that we associate with higher levels of activism, which we'll talk about later. And it may be that a community and a community archive is kind of somewhere in the middle. And maybe that they want to do all these things in the lower level, but they're also interested in learning from past struggles that the community has endured. Maybe they're not planning on translating them immediately into more activist endeavors, but they're just sort of starting to learn more about adversity that the community has faced in the past. And they're at kind of like a middle tier or moderate level of archival activism. And then there might be community archives that are engaging in a high level of archival activism. So they're engaging in lower level and moderate level types of activism, but they're actively focused on mobilizing solidarity. They're actively focused on intervening in public debates. They're actively focused on changing policy and discrimination. They're actively focused on documenting human rights abuses. So they're really, they're a community archive that is really operating on a high level of activism. And this goes back to the Carter article in week 1. The type of activism that those community archives were engaged in is definitely this higher level. They're trying to solidify the community. They're trying to intervene in public debates about whether or not their neighborhoods should be gentrified. They're trying to challenge what they see as discrimination in society against them, and they were attempting to use government records to identify sort of false information and other things that they were seeing going on, coming from the media and from politicians as well. I don't necessarily know that what they were engaged in is documenting human rights abuses. And again, not all these are going to apply to every community archive. But obviously, in certain circumstances, there are communities that have suffered human rights abuses, and community archives can definitely use the materials contained within the archives to document those human rights abuses and make people aware of them. It's also interesting to note that there might be some debate among community members about what level of activism a community and a community archive should be engaged in. And this is something that the CIFOR article talks about. So not every community or community member will feel comfortable being associated with activist community archives or being described as activists. So this goes back to the idea of participation and having conversations with community members to make sure that the actions of the community archive are aligned with what the community wants to see take place. Because if a community archive is maybe getting out over its skis a little bit and is maybe being more activist than the community it's representing feels comfortable with, then that can create problems, and it can create a situation where a community is not necessarily, or a community archive is not necessarily acting with the best interests of the community itself at heart. It's interesting to think if mainstream archives can engage in archival activism, if mainstream archives can themselves be activist archives. I think that you could argue that it's pretty easy for mainstream archives to help community members develop a community's identity through history. I think it is not unreasonable to expect that mainstream archives can develop educational materials about a community and distribute those in one way or another. Maybe an exhibit, maybe workshops or something like that. After that, I think it starts to get a little more difficult. So unless a mainstream archives has staff that are parts of the community, then it can be difficult for the community archive or for the mainstream archives to really learn from past struggles that the community has engaged in. It can certainly be a resource for members of the community to come in and learn more about the community and past struggles that the community has endured, assuming that a mainstream archives has records that sort of tell that story. But again, that's definitely not a given because of decisions that an archive may have made in the past about what types of records it wanted to collect and who has been represented in the archives historically. I think if a mainstream archives gets to the level where it's trying to mobilize solidarity within a community, to where it's trying to intervene in public debates and change policy and challenge discrimination, that's where a mainstream archives, I think, can start to run into some trouble, because that's where people who might be funding the mainstream archives might start to say, well, I'm not sure this is appropriate for you to do. You're meant to represent and work with the broader community, not just a specific part of the community that you represent. And this type of activism by mainstream archives can really ruffle a lot of feathers. And community archives, because they are maybe less reliant on certain institutions for funding, might have some freedom to engage at this high level that mainstream archives just don't. Everyone needs to pay attention to where their financing comes from. Everyone needs to pay attention to who they might anger if they are engaging in maybe a higher level of activism. And that's certainly an awareness that mainstream archives, who are never terribly well supported and well funded, need to be aware of. I also want to note that, as I kind of touched on, this high level of activism by community archives is going to be a response to a pretty acute and immediate need for activist work. So it's going to be a response to ongoing pressure and difficulty that a community is facing, not just some kind of background low-level marginalization or negative events for the community, but a really active need for people to step up and fight against something. And again, that's represented in the Carter article. And it's also interesting to note that this higher level of activism is one that's going to require the most resources and the most community support. So it can take a lot of time and effort to mobilize solidarity within a community at a really sort of high level. It can take a lot of time and effort to intervene in public debates and change policy and change policies and discrimination. It can take a lot of time and effort to document human rights abuses, especially if certain people in society don't want those abuses to be documented. So there's definitely a connection between this higher level of activism and more of a strain on the community archive itself and also the community that the community archive represents. And obviously that makes it more difficult, right? Because community archives may not be terribly well supported, and that can reduce their ability to engage in a higher level of activism, unfortunately. Okay, so next we'll take another look at the community-centric framework and see what kind of connections between it and these different activist activities that archives can engage in. And it's kind of interesting to think if having a community-centric framework in archives demands archival activism. You know, is archival activism a requirement for this framework to take place? And as I kind of touched on before, I think that you could argue that it does. So maybe Michelle Caswell is right after all. You know, for a community's interests, needs, and well-being to be centralized, you know, in society and even within archives, that is going to require communities to advocate for themselves and to attempt to gain power in society. You know, it's not something that's just going to happen kind of organically. You know, power doesn't change unless there's some impetus for that to happen, and even then, it changes very slowly. So there has to be some sort of pressure for that purpose to take place. And in order for a community's interests, needs, and well-being to be centralized, that shift in power needs to occur. And you know, the same is true for these next two bulletin points as well. So unless communities are empowered, it's going to be less likely that their records and materials are understood in their original context and not understood in the context that people more powerful in society provide for them. Unless a community is empowered, it's going to be less likely that a true complex and nuanced perspective of the community is going to be available in archives and in the media. You know, the default is most likely that that's not going to be the case. So, you know, communities need to engage in activism to make this be the reality. So I think you could say yes, for this community-centric framework, in archives and in society as a whole to take place, activism is a requirement. And so looking at some of these acts, you can see a lot of connection between them and this framework. So intervening in public debates can lead to community interest, needs, and well-being being centralized. Same with challenging discrimination and changing policies. Exploring identity through history, that can really only be done if community records materials are understood and valued in their originating context. If they're not understood and valued in their originating context, and they are sort of reframed and labeled by mainstream archives, then the true picture of a community's identity through history may not be available. And you can also connect that to community complexity and flux, are honored, recognized, and brought to bear on archival practice. For this identity to truly be seen through history, then there is a need to recognize the complexity and different aspects of a community. So you can definitely connect some of these archival acts and the need for these archival acts to this community-centric framework. To look at learning from past struggles, this is something that the Caswell article discusses quite a bit. This recognition by communities that their histories aren't just one triumphant march towards progress, but rather a pendulum swinging back and forth. And you can relate that to learning from past struggles and using past struggles to understand how archives, how community archives can operate in the present to address similar struggles that might be going on. And I think when you recognize this pendulum kind of moving back and forth, you are more aware of the flux and changes in communities as well. So just to connect that part of the Caswell chapter to some of the activist acts that we've discussed into to this framework as well. And finally, we'll look at something that I've touched on a little bit, how we can connect archival activism with community archives and the role of community archives in supporting representational belonging. So you can connect exploring identity through history through this sense of we were here, right? We are able to trace our identity and our community's identity through history, and that's given us a sense that we have a history, in this city, in this state, in this country, and that supports our sense of representational belonging. Related to that, developing educational materials that can also support a person's sense that I am here. Educational materials can help a person develop their sense of identity. Educational materials like workshops can be used to bring people together and develop their sense of we belong here. So there's definitely some connections between this activist act and really all three aspects of representational belonging. Mobilizing solidarity can definitely positively impact a person's sense that I am here and we belong here. Learning from past struggles can definitely help develop a person's sense of we were here. And also, we belong here. So, these things have happened to us in the past, and because of those, we are a vital part of of this society's fabric. And you know, when you learn that other people have struggled in the same way that you have, that can really strengthen the bonds that you feel with other people that have kind of gone through the same thing. And that can definitely develop this sense of we belong here and I am here. One interesting thing that the Caswell chapter talks about is this need to transform self-awareness into political action. So to translate the sense of representational belonging into additional activism, which is something that I kind of touched on earlier. So once a community has this sense of representational belonging, that's great, but what do you do with it? Do you just kind of sit back and feel good? Or do you use the positive benefits that having a sense of representational belonging can provide and use that to, again, continue to engage in activism and continue to attempt to rebalance power in society and continue to attempt to help your community gain power so that its well-being is a central consideration in archives and in society as a whole. So, you know, sort of where do we go from here? You know, we have a community archive that has helped us develop this sense of representational belonging, and how can we use that as a fuel to better our community? You know, if you just kind of get this sense of representational belonging and you get that warm and fuzzy feeling and stop there, then I guess that's good, but maybe there are additional steps that this sense of representational belonging can encourage you to take. And Caswell would argue, I think, that that is a very important next step for community archives and community members to engage in. Otherwise, there's just kind of wasted potential that really isn't being harnessed to continue to better the community. Because again, you know, the default is to go back to a situation where the people in society remain in society. And even if your community has some sort of initial successes, there's always going to be that weight of racism and capitalism and other issues that liberatory memory work are meant to work against, that are going to kind of drag communities and community power back to the status quo. And you know, unless communities continue to engage in activist endeavors, unless community archives continue to support activist endeavors or maybe be involved in activist endeavors themselves, then and maybe a situation where, you know, even initial successes are kind of, you know, forgotten over time, and things kind of return to the default, and the community may find itself in the situation that it was, you know, from the very beginning, and very little progress might actually occur, which is, you know, obviously an unfortunate situation. So this transformation from self-awareness into political action on kind of like a continual cycle is an important thing, and I do think it's something that community archives can facilitate and provide. So, okay, we will call it a lecture there. I hope that this discussion and these readings has helped you think more about what activism is, why activism might be needed, and how community archives especially, but even to a certain extent mainstream archives, can take actions that can support a rewiring of the power dynamics in society, even if only to a limited extent. And we'll continue to discuss the balance of power or the rebalance of power in society throughout the semester, just because it is such a fundamental part of why community archives exist in the first place, and how community archives can contribute to the well-being of the communities that they represent. So we'll definitely talk about some of these issues as we move through the semester. So thank you for listening. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and take care.